Welcome to our June webinar. Today we will talk about the science, so basically what science has to say about skin picking. We will take a look at the research and what we know currently about what's empirically proven to be an effective treatment option. We will organize another webinar next month as well. And the topic will be emotional regulation. This month's topic is less practical in nature, although I do hope you find it interesting. And then next month, we're returning to more practical and useful topics. Also, if you have some topics that you feel would be good to address in future webinars, you can always email me and we'll take them into consideration. So let's see what we will be talking about today. Whoops. So first, I will say a few words about how we look at mental health problems and what would be a general conception and a general approach to studying mental health problems. Then we'll talk a little bit about the epidemiology of skin picking. We'll talk a little about brain structures and sort of what all this means for therapy. And then afterwards, when we finish, we will, as usual, do a Q&A. As I go through the webinar, feel free to ask questions. Only I would ask you to use the Q&A button in Zoom instead of the chat, because it's much easier for me to just look at the Q&A and then mark the questions that I've answered, because usually there's quite a number of questions by the time I finish, and then this way I will make sure to answer all of them, or at least most of them, because the last time I was surprised by the number of questions. My part will be done in about 45 minutes, more or less. Last time it was more. I will really try to be on time this month, and then afterwards we will go to the Q&A. So let's start from a more general topic, which is sort of how can we even think about mental health problems, and what would be a comprehensive approach to mental health problems. What we typically talk about in medicine when we talk about health is what we call the biopsychosocial model. It's been heavily criticized by people from really very different fields. And no one seems to be quite happy with it, which usually means that it's a good model. In 2002, the World Health Organization adopted this as their official model, so it does have some sort of recognition. It was developed in the mid-70s by the man on the pixelated picture on your left. His name was George Engel. And he did this because he felt that at the time, the dominant approach to health was biological and sort of oriented towards the physical aspect of health, both mental health and physical health. And he felt that this only really shows just one side of the problem. And he felt that what we need is a more comprehensive approach, one that would give us a fuller picture of what an illness is. He felt that if you reduce an illness to just one aspect, you're really not giving it, you're not looking at it with all the complexity that it has. And then therefore you can't really provide effective treatment. So according to this, this model, if the slide would, okay, thank you, PowerPoint. So this is the simplest way that I can think of to represent the biopsychosocial model. So as you can see, we have three basic circles. So we can look at them as three different domains. When we have a disorder, it will come in straight in the middle here, and at the intersection of these three. So we can look at every mental health problem as having these three facets. Last time we talked about the psychological. We talked about how to discover what skin picking means and how to work with meaning itself. So we already addressed the psychological aspect. Today I will sort of go into this a little bit more, but only from a scientific point of view, and tell you about what science has to say and what research has shown that that we can, let's say, generally say about most people who pick their skin in terms of psychological development. We will focus a little more on biological factors, and we'll talk about brain imaging studies and certain epidemiological studies that can tell us something about the biology of skin picking. I was hoping, to be honest, to focus a lot more on this aspect, because last time I talked about psychology, so I thought it would be interesting to focus only on the neurobiology or neuroscience this time. But unfortunately, there's just not enough research to cover. There's not enough for me to create a diverse presentation for 45 minutes. That's what I'm going to say. And then there are the social factors, which include culture and our spiritual beliefs, our moral values, societal values, family relations, and all these different things. So you may wonder how all these three create a problem. So it's very easy for us to link health problems with biology. It's really very easy still to link psychological factors to mental health problems. But when I talk about this model, what people usually find confusing or not very intuitive are the social factors. And they're really very sort of quite important, and also in research usually not studied very much. So for example, we know that different psychiatric disorders will sometimes have slightly different presentations in different cultures. There's research done, it was, those studies are quite old, sorry, that talk about schizophrenia and how in different cultures you're more likely to have different constellation of symptoms and different types of hallucinations, for example. In some cultures, visual hallucinations will be more common. In other cultures, maybe auditory hallucinations will be. So it really does depend on sort of the value system and the cultural framework you're in. But there's also something that I didn't write here, and it's also very important, which is the socioeconomic conditions of a society and of a specific person. So maybe skin picking is not the easiest thing to connect to that, but I think if we talk about illness in general, for example, we have studies that you can find very easily that show that persons with lower income in the United States also have worse nutrition than more affluent people. So bad nutrition basically means fast food. A lot of fast food means more obesity. And if you're obese, you're more likely, for example, to develop diabetes type 2. So technically speaking, from this standpoint, diabetes type 2 is really very much a socioeconomic issue as well, not just a matter of insulin resistance, which would be a biological approach. And then there would be a psychological component to that, which would be how you cope with the illness, what the consequences of it are for your well-being, for your family relations, and so on and so on. So if we want to have a full picture of what it means to pick one's skin, and if we want to understand skin picking as a disorder, the fairest and best way that we can assess it is by using all these three aspects. Unfortunately, the social factors are something that really interests me very much, and I haven't found any research that I could present to you today. So we will mainly focus on the other two, on the biological and the psychological. So let's see what science tells us about how common it is, how common skin picking is, and sort of what are some of the properties of skin picking disorder. So currently, as you may know, it's characterized as a body-focused repetitive behavior disorder alongside trichotillomania, or which is pathological hair pulling, which sort of suggests that these two might be related. And both of them are on what we call the OCD spectrum, meaning related to obsessive compulsive disorder. So typically we tend to think of them as having a similar origin or shared pathophysiology, as I wrote here. When I talk about brain imaging studies later on, I will show you what some similarities and differences are as well, because they are similar but not the same. So there's justification to consider them separate problems. Prevalence is what usually surprises people, meaning that 1.2, so anywhere between 1.2 and a 5.4 of the general population will have a skin picking disorder at some point in their life. That's quite a lot. So 5.4%, that's more than most psychiatric disorders that are studied much, much more frequently than SPD is. And in a study that had about 900 patients in it, showed that the patients with OCD showed that about 15 to 16% of them also had skin picking disorder. So that's one more clue that these two come in pair very frequently. What else comes along with skin picking disorder? About a third of people who pick their skin are also likely to pull their hair as well. About a third is also likely to have a substance abuse problem. Another third, more or less, will have a major depressive disorder along with the skin picking disorder. And anywhere between a quarter or a half of people with skin picking will also have an anxiety disorder. So these sort of differing percentages are sort of based on what different studies will tell you. Then, of course, there's the obsessive compulsive disorder, as I mentioned before, and body dysmorphic disorder, which is about quarter to almost one half of the people. So there are three main patterns of skin picking when we talk about skin picking. So one is the compulsive skin picking, which is what we usually call focused skin picking as well. So that's when you're completely aware of what you're doing. The opposite of that would be automatic skin picking or mindless picking, which is the type of picking you do with minimal or no awareness at all. An example of that would be when you just sort of catch yourself picking while reading a book or watching TV or working or something along those lines. And then, as always with classifications, there's the mixed subtype, which in my experience is the most common one. At least with the clients that I've had the opportunity to work with in the SkinPick program, I think almost all of them had both types, so both compulsive and automatic. It's just that one would be more prevalent at a certain period of time. But usually you would have both at once. So most people would fall into the category of the mixed subtype. The reason why I'm talking about this very obvious classification is because it's used in studies to determine what will predict which type of picking. So there is one study that's referenced above. It's from this year that talks about different personality traits and how they are associated with different types of picking. So, for example, this study showed that avoidant personality traits were predictive of automatic or mindless picking, whereas borderline traits would predict both focused and mindless picking, and sadistic traits would predict the mixed subtypes. So I know that this sounds sort of dramatic. Borderline personality disorder is a well-known condition, not one that has a good reputation. And, you know, sadism, that also sounds quite dramatic. That doesn't mean that if you have either mindless picking or if your picking is primarily focused or both, it doesn't mean that you have any of these disorders. It just sort of means that they are fertile ground for a specific type of picking. So avoidant personality and automatic picking is something that's, at least for me, from a clinical perspective, rather simple and easy to connect. Because usually in situations when people want to avoid facing anxiety or anger or stress, they will pick. So it's kind of intuitively already, I think, makes sense. For borderline traits, it's slightly more complicated, and this study doesn't talk about this because they're just analyzing traits. But if I talk from a clinical standpoint, and as someone who works with many people who have this problem, borderline traits is something that we usually find in clients who have been picking since their adolescence, but not always, again. And sadistic traits, I wouldn't really want to get into that very much because it doesn't have that much of a practical value for me. And also, sadistic personality disorder is not something that exists in any classification that we currently use, either in DSM or in ICD. This is a line of research that also belongs to the psychological domain, and one that I find really very interesting. So it's a research that talks about how early maladaptive schemas are connected to skin picking. So this sounds very dramatic, but it's a very it's a sort of a very commonsensical concept. So it's just a schema is basically let's say like a jumble of emotions and thoughts and memories and events in your life and body sensations and what have you. So it's like it's a type of experience that activates in certain situations. So I'm trying to think of an example that might be very easy to understand. But so, for example, I have a puppy and sort of a dog. She's all grown up now. But when she was a puppy, she was attacked by a cat once. And so even today, every time she sees a cat or anything resembling a cat, sometimes even one of those stuffed toys, she will just immediately go to the other side of the room or cross the street. Because for her, that sort of brings up a complex of emotions or sensations. Don't know about thoughts and memories in dogs, but it brings up this sort of complex set of reactions every time when you see something that resembles what initially caused it or what initially scared her in that instance. So these schemas don't really operate on very high levels of cognitive awareness. That means that they will operate without you knowing it. And they can represent different cognitive schemas, can represent vulnerability factors for different conditions. And then there was a study that was done that sort of looked into these schemas and skin picking. The reason why I like this is because it's a very practical line of research. Some of these are not necessarily very useful. So, for example, the study that talked about personality constructs sounds interesting, but for me, when I work with a client, it's not very useful to think, okay, so this person has predominantly mindless picking, therefore they must have avoidant traits. I don't think that would logically follow from the study, and it's also not a very useful information because I'm not working with a generic person, I'm working with a specific client, and their experience at the end of the day has to trump any statistics. But with this, they offer, I think, very useful and sort of general enough ideas to cover a broad spectrum of clients, but they're also specific enough that they give me instructions on what to do in clinical work with someone. So let's look at what this line of research has produced. For some reason, I see now that I didn't put a reference to the paper, but if someone is interested, I will just email me afterwards and I will send you the reference. So what is it that they found, the authors? So they have found that higher dependence schemas were predictors of both focused and automatic skin picking, that emotional deprivation was a predictor for all types of skin picking. So emotional deprivation and schemas that come out of the experience of emotional deprivation in childhood can be fertile ground for any type of skin picking. And really, when I work with people, the question of what to do with one's emotions and how to process and understand emotions often comes up. Sometimes people will pick because they just cannot cope with anxiety or anger or sadness or conflict or frustration. And so this is a point where this study really very easily ties into my clinical work. So it tells me to go around looking for specific memories or specific body sensations or specific thoughts that would help us sort of dig up this maladaptive pattern, and then we can work with it. So automatic skin picking is related to higher approval or recognition seeking. Focused skin picking also to mistrust or abuse. And then another predictor of focused skin picking is alienation or undeveloped self, which is something that you actually also see in trauma research very much. So it also makes very practical sense. And it points us in a specific direction when you work with clients. And then failure to achieve is a predictor for a mixed subtype. And this is, I think, will be a familiar theme to most of you. And I tie this to perfectionism, or what people usually call perfectionism when we work together, which is this constant sense that you're just not good enough no matter how hard you try. This is a very, very common theme that I see in the SkinPick program. Usually this ideal of perfectionism is both set so highly and defined so vaguely that no matter what you do and how hard you try, you just end up failing. And then the pressure of perfectionism can cause you to pick, but at the same time, once you fail, that also prompts you to pick. So the need to achieve and the need to achieve perfectly is one of the most common, I think, triggers and predictors that I have seen so far. And so finally, one brain imaging study. I was really hoping to find more brain imaging studies because I really find them very interesting. Neuroscience is not so much in getting answers, I think, so much as giving me additional things to think about and more questions, really. So this study is, I believe, from 2017. There's a title there and the author is there. It's a study that was published in an open access journal, which means that you can download it for free and read it. If you understand the language of neuroscience, you won't have a very hard time understanding it. So the authors looked at two groups of patients in this study. One group were people with skin picking disorder, and then another group were healthy controls. The study is very small, and most studies, well, not most, I'll go out on a limb here and say all studies that I've read, all studies with skin picking disorder have very small sample sizes. This is a problem because it's very hard to generalize based on 20 or 30 participants in a study. So that's, however you look at it, that's not a representative sample. So in this study, they had 36 patients participating. 20 were patients who had SPD, and 16 were so-called healthy controls, so people who don't pick their skin. And so what they did is they did MRIs and then compared the brain scans of one and the other, and then measured thickness and sizes of certain brain structures. I summarized only a few of their findings here, but I will give you some more information on what they mean and what the implications of them are. So one is that they found that there are no differences in subcortical volume thickness between healthy controls and people with SPD. So what does this mean, and why would anyone measure something like subcortical thickness? So this is a badly phrased sentence on my part. It refers to certain subcortical structures that are usually altered in obsessive compulsive disorder. Because we assume that skin picking and trichotillomania, as BFRBs, are related to obsessive compulsive disorder. Usually when people analyze brains with MRIs or some other methods, we will want to look for things that we would find in OCD. That sort of that's a logical assumption given the clinical presentation of both disorders. They're both compulsive. They both include similar components in terms of not being able to control one's behavior, having specific thoughts and emotions and stuff like that. However, in this study, they didn't find many of the subcortical structures altered in people who pick their skin as well. Other studies have found some, so it's not very clear as to whether or not they share the common origin. They also found a negative correlation between right cortical thickness in parietal and temporal lobes and symptom severity. So I don't know if you can see my cursor here. I'm holding it on the green part of the brain here, so you can follow more easily. So this part here, this is the parietal cortex. This part down here, this is the temporal cortex. So what they found is that the more severe the symptoms are, the thinner the cortex. So that would be that's a negative correlation, which I badly spelled here. My apologies. That means that if you have fewer symptoms or if they're not very intense, then cortical thickness is increased. So it's inverse, sort of. In the parietal and temporal lobes. And one other part that they found, but that I didn't put in here, is this part here. If you can see where my cursor is, it's called a supramarginal gyrus. So what does this mean specifically? I find this finding, to me, this is a very interesting result. So the reason why is because parietal cortex and the disturbances that they have discovered can explain some very interesting things related to skin picking. So the supramarginal gyrus that I showed you here is part of something we call the somatosensory cortex, or the somatosensory associative cortex in this case, which means that among other things that it does, it's responsible for processing tactile sensations. And parietal cortex in general is something that we can associate with the urge to pick once you feel something that you would, let's say, call a bump or an imperfection in your skin. So that can be explained by the parietal lobe. And also another thing that and one other thing that can be explained is how sometimes picking can be extremely gratifying and how you can get pleasure from that. Well, this result can explain why. And then there is another interesting result, which is that there was a connection between the score you get on something called the Yale-Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale, which is just a fancy name for a questionnaire that you give to study participants that assesses their obsessive compulsive symptoms. So they found a connection to the thickness of the insular cortex. Insular cortex is the green part of the brain here. So typically you can't see insular cortex. Insula means island in Latin. And it's called island because it's basically below the surface of the brain, but it's part of the cortex. So it's alone there. And usually it's covered by the parietal and the temporal lobes. Then you have to move them apart so that you can reveal the insula. So if you notice that all these areas are sort of quite connected here. In fact, one of the things that they also found in this study is that the white matter under the cortex, which connects insula and the parietal and the temporal cortex, also exhibits some peculiarities. But I don't think we should get into this in this webinar because the implications for this can be quite diverse. But just to stick to the insular cortex, the reason why this is an interesting finding is because this is also something you very frequently find in OCD. In fact, I think in most studies that talk about the neurobiology of OCD, there are changes in insula, and specifically it's about risk aversion. So in this sense, they showed that there are some similarities to OCDs, like changes in this particular part of the cortex, but then also a lot of the things that you would find in terms of the alterations of sizes of these subcortical structures, so structures that are buried on the lower side of the brain, under the cortex, that you would normally see in OCD, they didn't find here. So there are some overlap. There is overlap between skin picking and OCD, but they're not identical. So there are definitely things that are specific only to OCD, things that are specific only to skin picking, and an area where they overlap. I think this is very interesting because it does tell us that they are completely separate disorders that may share some common features together. There are some other studies as well that you can find online and read, but the reason why I didn't present some of them is because their results tend to cancel each other out. So these authors expected to find something else compared to what they found. What they were actually looking for was how frontal cortex is different in people who pick their skin versus people who don't. Frontal cortex is this part here. You can see where I'm pointing, so it's on the left side of this image. This is what they expected to find. The reason why they would is because we already know that there are some frontal cortex changes in people who have trichotillomania, so hair pulling, and also in OCD. And then on the lower sort of part of the brain, there is a series of structures that we call the basal ganglia, which are usually in some way changed in studies of people who have OCD. And some of them are also changed in terms of their size and density with people who have hair pulling as well, but apparently not skin picking. So some studies will show findings like connections to frontal cortex, to basal ganglia. Other studies will show that there's no difference between people who pick their skin and people who don't. This is why I didn't include them, because these results are really very confusing. And the only conclusion that you can draw from that is that we really don't know, and then there's more research needed. It can mean that the samples were not really selected well because sample sizes are usually very small. For example, in this study, one of the faults that it has is the sample size that I already mentioned, and then another one, which is that all the participants had mild or moderate skin picking. So they didn't include anyone who picks their skin to a very severe degree. So in that sense, they also excluded an important component, which is this increased severity, which would maybe make some changes visible that weren't visible before in terms of what you see when you look at brain structures. And then if you have studies that show today this, and then tomorrow another study disproves it, that also begs the question whether or not the finding was incidental. So there are some interesting findings and interesting things to think about, but there's not much that neuroscience can say for sure about skin picking at this point. This study is interesting, but then it's only 36 participants, and really we need bigger studies and we need more studies. So in case you're a millionaire who doesn't know what to do with their money, donate to skin picking research, because there are many good researchers out there, but I don't think there's enough interest to do studies like this or to finance them. So that would be the brain imaging studies. So at this point, when I talk to people and I mention that we can see some changes in the brain, they will immediately jump to several conclusions that all boil down to the same thing, which is, can I possibly be helped if there is something different about my brain? I remember when I went to medical school, which wasn't that long ago, we were taught that basically, if you see differences in brain structures, well, that's just what it is. We were taught that as you grow older, you will essentially only lose brain cells, but you can't really gain new ones. So essentially, maybe 20 years ago, people would say that, well, you're doomed. Now we know that it's really not that simple. For example, those of you, if there are any of my clients listening to this, you know how obsessed I am with mindfulness. And one of the reasons why I'm obsessed with mindfulness is because mindfulness shows us that biology is not necessarily our destiny. And that it's not just that our brains shape our behavior, which they undoubtedly do, but that it's also the other way around, that our behaviors shape our brain, and that it's actually a two-way street. So how do we know this from mindfulness? Is because we have a lot of studies that show that if you do mindfulness for a certain period of time, and if it's a structured, well thought out practice, after 8, 10 or so weeks, you will actually begin to see changes in your brain structure. So there will be visible, measurable changes if you do an MRI before and after. And there are some studies that were done on Buddhist monks who basically all they do is just meditate all day. And these studies show really fascinating research and really tell us that it's not just that our brain will tell us what our life will be like and what we'll have to be stuck with, but that also our persistent exercise, practice, and patient work can actually change the way our brains work. So even though there are some findings, I would never be so apocalyptic about it to say that there's nothing that we can do to change things. It may make change slow. And I think actually this is really a very good way to spin these, it just occurred to me, to look at these results. And they show that if there are some maybe specificities about the way that the brain works in people who pick their skin, that can explain why change is slow and why change is hard. Because it's not just about learning why something happens or finding different ways intellectually how to cope with it. It's also about sort of rewiring and retraining your brain. And that is a process that takes time. So if you're ever impatient about the speed of change, and if you're disheartened by ups and downs in change, just think of this. Just remember the green little insula and think that it's very slow and it needs time to actually alter. So let's look at another aspect of research, which is validating. Sorry, I'm just looking at my clock here because last time I said I was going to talk for 45 minutes, and then I ended up talking for almost an hour and a half, and I really want to try and stick with the schedule for once in my life. So let's look at what studies have to say about different treatment options and what's effective and what isn't. First, let's take a look at pharmacotherapy. You will see all kinds of results here, and then we'll discuss them one by one so that we can see what this actually means. So there are studies with fluoxetine, which is Prozac, basically. And so it's an SSRI type of antidepressant. There are two studies that I was able to find. And in both, they say that that fluoxetine is effective, but only slightly better than placebo after 6 and 10 weeks. So that means that if you take it for a month and a half or 2.5 months, chances are you will be slightly better off than if you take nothing at all. So effective, but not something to write home about or get terribly excited about. We have citalopram, which is also an SSRI, in a study on only 45 people. So also look at these numbers where you have, and that's how many people participated in the study. So 45 subjects were tested over a period of 4 weeks, and the dose was about 20 milligrams per day. After a month, so after the 4 weeks of treatment, what researchers found was that everyone had, or at least the majority had, lower scores on the Yale-Brown OCD scale, but there were no differences on the visual analog scale. So some results, yes, impressive results, not quite. A chemical very similar to citalopram was also tested on a slightly smaller sample of only 29 subjects for 18 weeks. So that's almost 5 months, a little 4.5 months, with flexible dosage, which means that it was adjusted for each participant individually. And this result actually looks very encouraging. Almost half of the participants experienced complete remission, and about a little less than 1/3 experienced a partial response, which means that symptoms decreased, but only partially, so they didn't stop taking completely. So this looks very good, right? I like the results, but my mind immediately goes to something which is, so we need another study, and we need a bigger study, and we need a follow-up study, and we need a randomized control study. So this is just one study with only 29 people. In science, that's really not very much. We need a follow-up study. So even if someone stops speaking after the treatment, the question is, when you stop taking the drug, for how long the results stay this way? Does speaking come back, and so on. So, and also when it's a small sample, you also have to be careful about selection bias and to think about sort of whether the sample is actually representative of an average person that picks their skin. So the results are very, very good, but that's just one study, and it really doesn't show that this specific drug is very effective. Then the next one on the list is a mood stabilizer, or at least in psychiatry, it's a mood stabilizer. In neurology, it's an anti-epileptic drug. There are two studies that I was able to find. One showed that it was somewhat effective. The other showed that it's not really at all better than placebo. And then there's the old faithful that everyone knows about, that's NAC. There was a study that I found that lasted for 12 weeks, so that's about 3 months, in the dosages that you see here, up to 3,000 milligrams a day. That's 3 grams. And about half of the participants in the study experienced improvement, which sounds good, right? But at the same time, it says 19% of those that were on the placebo also experienced improvement. So it's effective, but exactly how effective, I think, is questionable. And there is some research on psychotherapy as well. I kept this for last because I'm a therapist, so I'm biased, and then I want to sort of finish off with talking about how therapy works. The oldest treatment that we have for skin picking is habit reversal training. Today, I think there are therapists out there who only use still habit reversal training, but most people integrate habit reversal with something else. So in SkinPick program, for example, habit reversal is a part of the program, but only a small part. This is because habit reversal is effective, but not that effective. And it teaches you how to minimize damage, and it teaches you how to establish control over picking, but it doesn't really work on any underlying issues. And since the 70s, when habit reversal training was created, psychotherapy has obviously advanced, and specifically cognitive behavioral techniques and therapies have really branched out and developed and changed. So the spectrum of tools that we have now is much better than it was back then. So we usually add more things. So when you use habit reversal training alone, so that's using competing responses, those of you that are in the program, you're probably familiar with that. That's session 3 material. For those of you that are not in the program and don't know what competing responses are, that's everything that you would do when you feel the urge to pick, so as to avoid picking. It's a way to redirect the urge to pick onto something else. So I always keep some to show you when I have webinars. So this would be like one example of a competing response. This is an infinity cube, which I bought so that I can test it to see how well it works for the program, but then I really liked it. It's a really nice toy. So if you feel the urge to pick, you sort of just play around with your infinity cube. Or another thing would be, for example, a worry stone, which you can rub, or so I don't have it next to me, a squeeze toy or stuff like that. So those would be competing responses. So a study that was 4 weeks long that included habit reversal training. It was a randomized controlled study with only 34 participants, showed that it was beneficial, and they did a follow-up after 2 months, and those clients that kept using competing responses were still getting good results. So that is also a small study. If you can see the pattern, all the studies, literally all of them, are really quite small. But this one shows 2 things that are important for us. One, that habit reversal works, and 2, that it gives sustainable results. This is really important to me, and I don't like it when studies don't include follow-ups, because when people finish a therapeutic program of any kind and they experience benefits by the end of it, that doesn't mean that these results will stay with them for 2 or 3 or 5 months or a year. So for me, it's very important to know that results remain stable after 2, 3, or 6 months. There was another study, but it was not a controlled study. So it was just 150 participants, and they were given a self-help internet-based CBT program. So the reason why I find this to be very important is because it indirectly shows why SkinPick program is also effective. It's an internet-based CBT program, and it's doing something online and doing something in person, face-to-face, is quite different. So in SkinPick and in this program as well, what you do is you work with written material. In case of SkinPick, of course, you communicate with your therapist, but you communicate in writing as opposed to having face-to-face sessions. And this program, which didn't include a therapist at all, was a self-help program. Basically used what we can, I guess, call bibliotherapy, which means that you would read certain materials and then they would give you tasks to perform. And even in that form, it was effective. So internet-based therapy also works. That's just one study with a sample that's probably the biggest sample that I've managed to find. It was 150 participants. There was another study of habit reversal training with decoupling in the form of bibliotherapy. So decoupling is an addition to habit reversal training, and some studies show that it's effective, some studies don't show that it's effective alone, but when coupled with habit reversal training, it does work. So the 4 weeks internet-based study showed that it works. And then there was another study that I also was happy to see and that I thought was very encouraging, is a study that shows the effectiveness of ACT and HRT together. This is basically SkinPick, because SkinPick is a program based on ACT that incorporates HRT. So it's too many acronyms. So ACT is acceptance and commitment therapy. It's a type of cognitive behavioral therapy. And habit reversal training is habit reversal training. So when you join these two together, in 2 small studies, they almost produced a complete cessation of symptoms for the duration of the treatment. Now, I don't like these. To me, when I see that something led to complete cessation of symptoms, my immediate thought is they selected a very good sample, because real life therapy is much messier than that. There are plenty of people who can stop almost completely. If you attended the last month's webinar, I presented a case and a client that I worked with, and she also experienced a near complete cessation of symptoms. But that is not always the case, because it depends on many, many different factors. When did you start picking? How long have you been picking? Sort of how willing you are to try different techniques, how patient you are, how much time you can devote to that. So there are many different factors that will affect the outcome. And reality is always sort of messier than the studies. But it is very encouraging to see that CBT, a specific form of CBT, which is ACT, that it works, that habit reversal techniques work. That means that there are plenty of psychotherapeutic options out there available for you. What's also, I think, good news for people is that there are some self-help options that also work. Why I say this is because not everyone can afford therapy, and even SkinPick, which is not, I think, a very expensive program, is still too expensive for some people. And as you can see, there are self-help options out there available for you as well, and they can also be effective if you can follow through with them and adhere to the program that you select. So what does this mean? So yeah, Kelly again. If you were here last time, you probably remember that I was gushing over how brilliant Kelly is, and he's where I am. Kelly is also. So when you look at this, the research that I presented, there's some research that talks about adverse events in childhood, that talk about sort of how our cognition develops, our cognitive schemas, some studies that talk about brain structure. I didn't mention any genetic studies because there are no studies that specifically connect skin picking to certain genes. But now when we're at this topic, there are some attempts to connect skin picking to genes that have to do with grooming, and there are some studies, well, what should be normal grooming. And then there are some studies that connect hair pulling with certain genes that have to do with grooming. And then there are also sort of wider connections to the OCD spectrum and genetics as well. But none of this has been extensively documented or conclusively sort of established. So it's all very vague, and there are no, to my knowledge, at this point in time, there are no studies that connect specific genes to skin picking. This is why I didn't include it. But there's one study that just occurred to me that I read a while ago that said that a study that included twins that concluded that there are generational patterns with skin picking, and a study that concluded there's that basically genetics explains 40% of variance in a certain sample, which is, I suppose, quite promising for further research. But then again, that also is not, that's also not very conclusive. So anyway, back to this slide. So what is it? nature or nurture? So is it psychological or is it biological? And is it even worth looking at it this way? The biopsychosocial model would tell us to look at all the components at the same time, but it wouldn't really tell us whether or not something is essentially biological or psychological or social. And then in order to answer this question, I turn to Kelly because he usually has good answers. I'm going to read this quote and then tell you why I think is very important and why it can give us the answer to this question. So he says the following: we assume that all our present interpretations of the universe are subject to revision or replacement. We take the stand that there are always some alternative constructions available to choose among in dealing with the world. And then there's the quote that I also quoted last time: no one needs to paint himself into a corner, no one needs to be completely hemmed in by circumstances, and no one needs to be the victim of his biography. We call this philosophical position constructive alternativism. So what Kelly basically says is that there are many ways in which we can conceptualize reality. Are they all equally good? Well, no, they're not. But can we really know what reality is in itself? Again, no, we cannot. So Kelly would basically say that there are many ways in which we can conceptualize skin picking, and that maybe we don't really have to limit ourselves to a specific way. Because at the end of the day, according to Kelly's philosophy of constructive alternativism, we can't really know what the world is outside of the way in which we construe it. So I can't really leave my body and my mind and then look at things objectively. And this also goes for science as well, because science is practiced by humans, and there's sort of, as you can see from the research, there are some studies that show this, some studies that show that. And then what we do eventually is we do a whole bunch of studies and then analyze all these results and come to some kind of consensus, which is also reached by humans. So even when we talk about whether science discovers what reality really is, I think that's also debatable. Is science useful? Absolutely. Do I love science? Absolutely. Can I 100% say that science discovers what reality really is? No, I can't. Do I believe that it does? Perhaps. So Kelly tells us that we don't really have to limit ourselves in terms of how we look at skin picking, and we don't have to say skin picking is a brain disorder. We also don't have to say it's only psychological. We also don't have to say it's a consequence of an early trauma or a maladaptive schema that will now haunt us forever. And there's also, the reason why I'm saying all this is that we have to be very careful about how we define a problem. My proposal for you is that we don't have to define it in general terms whatsoever. In fact, I think the more theories we have and the more diverse theories about skin picking that we have, the better. So why do I say this? When we work in therapy, I don't work with your brain. So I don't work with your parietal cortex. I don't really even know how to speak to your parietal cortex. What I work with is a whole person. And every person that comes to me and that I work with, and not just me, every therapist, has a completely different set of experiences in their life. So when we talk about skin picking, we're actually talking about a behavior that can have many causes and many consequences. Not all have to be the same for all people. So in my experience as a therapist, and in my sort of personal approach to this, it's really good if we keep an open mind and then see what fits. So Kelly also pretty much backs this up. He says that every theory that we can come up with in science or otherwise has its range of convenience. That means that not every theory is applicable to everything. So if, I don't know, so for example, if we look at the brain studies for skin picking, we can perhaps one day come up with a biological theory of skin picking. Will this be applicable to OCD? Well, not necessarily. Will OCD theories be applicable to skin picking? Not necessarily. So in that sense, every theory that you come up with has events that it explains very well and those that explains less well. In practical clinical terms, when someone comes to therapy, we have to see what fits them. So, and Kelly says pretty much this. He says a theory must conform to events in order to predict them, which kind of makes sense, right? So you have to be able to explain certain events in order to be able to say that the theory is good. And he says the number of alternative ways of conforming are, as far as we know, infinite. So that means that we can find infinitely many ways of conceptualizing skin picking. And this is why, as therapists, we always like to hear our clients' stories, because then we can come up with a personalized interpretation of what skin picking is. And then this is the quote that I put in the end, is one that I really like. He says, the events do not come around and tell us how to do the job. They just go about their business of being themselves. The structure we erect is what rules us. And I think this is the crucial point. And maybe if I'm trying to make a single point, that's the one that I would make, which is that the way you conceptualize skin picking is going to tell you how you will be able to deal with it. If you conceptualize your skin picking as just having a different brain, then I suppose all you can do is shrug and say, oh, well, that's just my brain. I'll just have to learn how to live with it. If you conceptualize your skin picking in terms of it being just genetic, then what exactly can you do except say, well, those are just genes? If you conceptualize it as something that's a product of, let's say, early maladaptive schemas, for example, you can say, okay, let me see what kind of schema that is, and is there something I can do to change it? At the same time, you can also adopt a more optimistic approach. If you conceptualize something as being essentially biological, but you're more flexible or contemporary, let's say, neuroscientist, you can say maybe there is something you can do and something that you can change, but it will take time for you to change it. So it's not going to be quick. And then depending on the type of approach, the theoretical approach you adopt, it's how you're going to approach it in real life. So for example, if you look at these, let's say this, it says 4 weeks to create visible effects that will be present after 2 months, and you start with that theory, and then after, let's say, a month and a half, you still don't experience any setbacks, you can end up very frustrated with yourself, because the theoretical model that you had when you were starting therapy didn't really pan out for you. So in that sense, if you adopt a model and then the reality of your situation doesn't follow through, you can end up really very frustrated. And when you're very frustrated and very impatient, you can become more anxious, and more anxious you are, the more likely you are to pick again. And in that sense, your theory can sadly confirm itself and become reality. So we have to be very careful how we approach conceptualizing skin picking. In fact, I think it's really for the best if we always approach it from whatever the client's story is, and then keep an open mind. Because sometimes a theory will serve a purpose for, let's say, a few months, and then you may have to discard that theory and replace it with another theory. And at the end of the day, where we started from was the biopsychosocial model, and it tells us that no matter what may be the ultimate cause, if there is such a thing, different domains of our experience will affect our condition. So the most prudent thing that we can do is affect all these domains at the same time to achieve the best possible effect. So this is where I would finally stop.